So in this talk, I'm going to compare two particular processes, two particular methodologies. POP, which is process-oriented pedagogy, and OBE, which is outcomes-based education. I'm going to pose the question, are they really so incompatible? This particular talk is based upon a series of articles that appeared in the ELT Journal, which are available in your folder. One by William Littlewood and one by David Bell, and it's part of a series that ELT, English Language Teaching Journal, runs called Counterpoint. And it's a very useful series to check into because what it tends to do is present particular viewpoints, current viewpoints in English language teaching methodology, and pose an opposing view. So that's what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be arguing against a particular position taken by William Littlewood. I'm going to start by outlining Littlewood's position, his arguments, and then I'm going to argue against that particular viewpoint. So these are the actual articles. They appeared in ELT Journal 2009, and the first one is Process-Oriented Pedagogy for the Facilitation, Empowerment, or Control. And my response to it was another breakthrough, another baby out with the bathwater. And then Littlewood gets a chance to make a rejoinder. And his response is OBE, a coin with two sides or many different coins. And you can read them all together in ELT Journal, and you'll also find them in your folder. So, what is POP? What is process-oriented pedagogy? Well, to begin with, it's a movement away from the notion of language in terms of products to processes that are involved in using language for communication and negotiating meaning in real context. So that means a movement away from some of the very limited notions of products in terms of structure, grammatical structures, and a movement to those kinds of activities, those kinds of processes we need to achieve particular communicative goals. It's also a movement towards personal learning strategies away from an imposition of one particular learning theory or strategy imposed upon students to the development of their own particular learning strategies. And that is intended to lead to autonomous performance and learners' individualized development. So it's a movement to student autonomy. The particular processes are all encompassing in many ways. The idea is to encompass cognitive processes, social processes, and affective processes, which all together develop a whole person approach to language and language teaching. And finally, and this is an underpinning in many ways of liberal education, there's a greater emphasis on creating learning contexts which stimulate motivation and provide opportunities for personal growth. So the aim of a process-oriented pedagogy is the development of the individual self. Let's contrast now process in progress, as we've just described, with what Littlewood terms process as outcomes. These particular descriptions are not mine, they're Littlewood's, and if you find them a little baffling, well, so do I. So if we look at process in progress, it provides a perspective which is the underpinning for liberal humanistic approaches. and these emphasize learner choice, individual development, and autonomy. And it's the intention to facilitate growth in personally meaningful directions. On the other hand, processes outcome perspective provides prior specifications of the directions that learners should follow. So you can begin to see these appear to be two kind of contradictory approaches, one based upon autonomy and development of personal self, development of the whole person, and the second one in terms of pre-specifications as to the directions that learners should move towards. So we're asking the question whether outcomes and processes are indeed incompatible. So let's make some notes here. To the extent that the processes which we want to facilitate are individual, we cannot indeed, would not want to predict their direction and outcomes. This is Littlewood's conception of the contradiction between student autonomy and pre-specified outcomes. Second, Littlewood notes that there is a significant shift in emphasis and intention when we say that some outcomes are more desirable than others, so that we should guide learning towards them with the desire of empowering students for their future life. And in that in itself sense is something that Littlewood accepts as an inevitable part of the process of education, is that we want to move students towards these more desirable outcomes. But, as Littlewood points out, there's an equally significant shift when these desirable outcomes are determined not by those directly involved in the pedagogical process, but from outside. And he's thinking in terms of governments, government committees, government appointees, moving to control over what happens in learning situations. And this results in the fact that the voices of teachers and learners are often drowned in the name of accountability. And control stays in the hands of those who also, what he wants to maintain is that control stays in the hands of those who have the expertise to make decisions about what happens in terms of the learning process. And they are also that we draw benefits from process-oriented teaching while avoiding its dangers. So what Littlewood fears is that once we make a move from trying to point students towards desirable outcomes, then we can make another shift where people not in the learning situation can dictate those desirable outcomes, and they may not be the people with the expertise to make those decisions. What I want to argue about Littlewood's position is it conforms to the classic pendulum swings that we find in methodology and especially in language teaching. And this is the notion of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And this refers to a classic quote of Swan, and which he made many years ago with respect to communicative language teaching. Let me quote Swan. The characteristic sound of a new breakthrough in language teaching theory is a scream, a splash, and a strangled cry as once again the baby is thrown out with the bathwater. To me, pop sounds like a new breakthrough, and the critique of outcomes-based education sounds like one more baby being thrown out with the bathwater. Hence, my response to Littlewood, what I want to argue here is that process-oriented pedagogy has its position, has its place as one more option, one more methodological choice through which we can achieve particular goals in particular contexts, and also outcomes-based education also is one more valid tool which allows us to make choices and to achieve particular goals. So I'm arguing for the fact that we need to embrace both of them. Let me make a distinction between control and influence. Littlewood tends to demonize outcomes-based education in terms of control. And let me quote from him. This is Littlewood. Even outside totalitarian systems, the more detailed and far-reaching these specifications for acting and thinking become, the stronger is their potential to become powerful instruments for exerting control and imposing the policies and values of those in authority. Big Brother is watching you. And that in itself is quite a demonization by looking in terms of control. Because if we contrast that with the notion of influence, we get quite a different view of education. But before I go on to that, that particular viewpoint of outcomes-based education as expressing government control puts Littlewood, and I'm sure he wouldn't want to be in the same bed as people like Phyllis Schlafly, the conservative ideologue, who has argued that OBE is a process for government telling our children how to live, what to say, what to think, what to know, and what not to know. You have to understand that particular position in terms of what we call states' rights. That is the ability of states to determine what happens in schools, and that can empower certain majorities in particular situations to determine that what their children need to know is based upon religious or racist norms in those particular societies. So it does, if you think about it, put Littlewood, whose approach is very liberal, in the same situation as someone like Schlafly, whose approach is quite conservative. If we now just flip to the other side, to influence, what we notice is that great educators have always been very explicit about what they're trying to achieve through the kinds of educational systems they endorse. The pictures here are Thomas Dewey, Socrates, Loyola, Ignatius Loyola, and Rudolf Steiner, all of whom developed very explicit, very important approaches to education. I'm going to quote now. This is a quote from Reardon, and it's interesting that Littlewood also quotes from Reardon, but Littlewood takes his quotes quite out of context. If you look at the larger quotes here of Reardon, what he's saying is that inevitably we need to make explicit the particular goals of any particular educational approach. So let me quote Reardon then. It seems self-evident that we should be clear and explicit about how we want our students to be able to think and what we want them to be able to do as a result of their education. And again, students will learn more effectively when we have made clear at our own institutions and in our own programs, not just what they will study, but also how they will be able to act and think as a result of their education. Is that control or is it influence? Notice that these four educators created systems, educational systems with different sets of values, which as students, as stakeholders, we should have an ability to choose between them and to say which set of explicit particular values we want to follow. What often happens, especially in a public school setting, is that it's not that the government is controlling the particular outcomes, the children's outcomes, but the outcomes in fact are not explicit, and they tend to often follow a particular hidden curriculum of that particular local community. So if we look at this in terms of top-down, let's talk about top-down as being decisions made on larger levels like government levels, and then bottom-up made in the particular classroom. What I really want to focus on is not the top-down, bottom-up dichotomy, but the dichotomy of opaque and transparent goals or outcomes. It seems to me that a far more favorable side of this diagram is on the right-hand side, where outcomes, whether they're from top down or from bottom up, are explicit, as opposed to potentially situations where a top-down approach muddies the particular curriculum where the goals are hidden, and also from a bottom-up approach where they can also be hidden too. Let me just put this in a framework and look at a particular famous top-down example from history. And this is Thomas Dewey, and Thomas Dewey is known for his emphasis on the importance of local control of education. Dewey actually supported the educational reforms of Kemal Atatürk in Turkey. Atatürk was a pretty autocratic ruler in Turkey, and what he imposed upon Turkey was quite sweeping changes. Let me quote here from Dewey. There is a danger that too much and too highly centralized activity on the part of the ministry will stifle local interest and initiative, prevent local communities taking the responsibilities which they should take, and produce too uniform a system of education, not flexibly adapted to the varying needs of different localities, urban, rural, maritime, and to different types of rural communities, different environments, and their different industries. There is also a danger that any centralized system will become bureaucratic, arbitrary, and tyrannical in action. What Dewey's pointing out here is not his opposition to the philosophies of and reforms of Ataturk, which included education for girls, which included in terms of linguistics the move towards a Romanized alphabet in the schools for Turkish. What he's arguing against here is that any of these particular top-down specifications need to have local agreement, local support. Contrast that with a bottom-up approach, and this is where outcomes emergent outcomes approach. And this is a quote from D'Andrea. Using an outcomes-based approach to organizing teaching allows teachers to clarify for themselves the implicit outcomes that are always part of any teaching and learning activity. Implicit outcomes are always part of any teaching and learning activity. So this is an attempt to make them explicit. It allows for reflective interrogation of all aspects of pedagogical practice and assist in the selection of appropriate teaching, learning, and assessment strategies. So between the example of Dewey, who was supporting top-down outcomes, and D'Andrea's quote here, where outcomes are determined at a localized classroom level, what is essentially important is that all aspects of our teaching in terms of their goals are explicit. I would argue that one of the problems, and we'll go on to look at this, is that problems of process-oriented approaches is very often the goals are not explicit, they're not clear. Let me just clarify a particular distinction that Littlewood makes here, and I want to argue that products are not outcomes. So outcome-based education is not the same as product-based education. If we look at products may not be explicitly articulated, okay, but outcomes have to be explicitly described. Outcomes are explicit descriptions of competencies connected to other competencies with regard to real-world skills, attainment of which are measured through authentic assessment. Contrast that with the fact that products may not be explicitly articulated. They mainly exist as unconnected, discrete items rather than being part of an interlocking system of outcomes. They're often not connected to real-world language needs. For example, the 5-paragraph essay is an abstraction, an invention, which is really not related to any particular real-world writing task. And finally, products are assessed by tests in terms of points or letter grades. They're not evaluated in terms of authentic assessment, i.e., has the student managed to accomplish that particular competency? One way of looking at the kind of dichotomy that Littlewood describes between process-oriented pedagogy and outcomes-based education is a distinction between direct and indirect teaching. Okay. If we look at, here's a quote from Hedge, a focus on a list of items to be taught and the creation of an optimal environment that facilitates the process through which language learning takes place is an ideal description of what we should be doing in the classroom. But notice it's a balance between a list of items to be taught and the creation of the optimal environment that facilitates the processes. And that encapsulates both direct and indirect teaching. Another way of describing this has been the distinction between weak and strong communicative language teaching. So a strong communicative language teaching would be more interested and focused on communicative practices, pair work, group work, whereas a weak approach is more concerned with the grammatical and functional ways in which we achieve those particular communicative goals. And a similar distinction is made by Widdowson between language as communication and teaching language for communication. The probably easiest way to look at this is between direct and indirect teaching. And Sells-Mercier et al. 1997 give a very nice history of language teaching, how it's moved between direct and indirect and back to direct. So if we think of methodologies like audiolingual method, it is very direct teaching, or grammar translation is a better example, is very direct teaching. And even with audiolingual method, the reaction to that in terms of communicative language teaching, especially strong communicative language teaching, if you think of the ideas of Krashen, who doesn't believe in explicit grammar teaching, then you have a very indirect way of teaching. And then a reaction to Krashen has been the recognition that we need to focus on form, because focusing on form is one step to achieving the particular communicative competence that we're striving for in the classrooms. So to put that in the framework of POP and OBE, POP is very much focused on indirect teaching, creating the processes and conditions in which learners can develop their own particular identities and become autonomous learners. Direct teaching requires an intervention. It needs to say, this is what the explicit elements are that you need to achieve your particular goals. And this involves specific grammar teaching or teaching of particular communicative functions. Another way of getting at this and of looking at process versus outcomes-based education is to look at Hyland's critique of process writing. So if we go through this critique, this is about writing, and see, I want you to think in terms of generalizing this to the whole POP, processes, pedagogy, methodology, which doesn't necessarily just include writing. Of course, it includes all the other skills. So firstly, Hyland points out that the emphasis on processes decontextualizes language from very real purposes that language is used for in the real world and the conventions that constrain its use. Okay, so there is an end result to that process. We have to write a research paper that conforms to the particular conventions of the journal that we're submitting our articles to. Second, there is an opacity of this particular inductive discovery-based approach, and that tends to favor those students who already implicitly are familiar with the particular target patterns of interaction. And it disadvantages students who are unable to detect the invisible curriculum. So it did, by not making explicit particular goals, outcome goals, it can disadvantage those who are not steeped in this particular genre and who already have some inkling of what the particular goals are. So it tends to have an invisible curriculum. Three, notions of personal growth and critical thinking tend to reflect a Western ideology of individualism, and that might conflict with other collectivist ideologies, and that's often been the reaction to communicative language teaching in various parts of the world, where they've been resistant to that particular approach. Explicit learning outcomes can emancipate both students and teachers. And finally, by stressing individual motivation, personal freedom, self-expression, and learner responsibility, process-oriented pedagogy risks, and this may seem interesting, disempowering teachers and rendering them mere process facilitators. So in the sense that teachers are not intervening and doing direct teaching, they're just facilitating a process, which in a sense makes teaching a lot easier if all we have to do is create communicative activities and we never feed in any particular language outcomes and we never point to particular specifications that we want to come out of that particular communicative activity. Okay, let me finish here by juxtaposing the notion of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And his very famous quote from John Adams. John Adams said, I must, and John Adams is one of the great founding fathers of the American Revolution. And so at the time of the Revolution, he made this particular statement. I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. Okay, he's got a war to fight. He needs to understand and know about war and how to conduct a revolutionary war. Later generations can become potters. Similarly, if you take say, a modern-day immigrant hotel worker. And in the vein of John Adams, she might say, I must study English management and information systems, and I must master an Excel spreadsheet so that my daughters can study law and medicine, so that their daughters may study dance and music. So she might say, yeah, I love dance and music, but I got to get a job. I got to make some money. So the particular needs of students can vary. Not all students have the luxury of having particular intrinsic motivation such that they can afford to allow a process of self-discovery to take place. Many students have specific needs, and process-oriented pedagogy may totally ignore those particular needs, that extrinsic needs that students have. So, let me conclude here. As in everything, we have to balance particular methodologies. So we should not uncritically accept methodologies such as OBE and POP, but nor should we dismiss them out of hand. We can't keep throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Babies are precious things. They take what, 9 months to make, and a lot of nurturing after that. Second, we have to accept outcomes as one more tool and process-oriented teaching as yet another tool, which together can enrich the repertoires of teachers and their ability to respond to the complex and ever-changing needs of their students. Think about children in an elementary education situation. Process-oriented pedagogy may be the best methodology for them to grow and to learn. But what if you work in a car rental agency and you have very specific language needs? Then you don't want to go to a class and discover yourself. You need very specific outcomes. Okay, so one way of thinking of outcomes then is not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of competency, competencies as tools. And this is a quote from Auerbach, and her article, 1986 article, is seminal in the way that she frames this whole particular debate. So rather than promoting the acquisition of pre-specified behaviors as the central goal, we need to develop a model which begins with, firstly, problematize aspects of reality. What are we trying to do? What are students trying to achieve? Promote critical reflection on that reality. And 3, incorporate competencies as means for taking action to achieve those particular goals. So in this sense, outcomes are something that we develop from a bottom-up situation, but we're always trying to make them explicit and discover what students need. So in this model, teachers and students determine jointly what skills are needed to shape or influence reality. Competencies become tools in service of a transformative education rather than constraining framework for instruction. And this description by Auerbach, I think, expresses fundamentally the importance of outcomes-based education, or as she describes it, competencies as tools.